Welcome to the Buddhist Society today on our 95th anniversary, our Founders' Day, to celebrate both the life of Christmas Humphreys and also the 95 years that Buddhism has been taught here. It's a very special day, and to think that Buddhism has been in this country for so long, certainly at this society, is a wonderful thing to celebrate. And to mark that occasion, we have with us today Alexander Maitland. Alexander has written many biographies of people interested in Buddhism, and he's given many talks here. And we're very pleased that he's here today with us to talk about Milarepa. Milarepa is one of the great figures in Tibetan Buddhism, in fact, in Tibetan Buddhism and world religion. His association with Marco Pallis will be described in the following talk. Marco Pallis wrote a really important book at the time, Peaks and Lamas, and it was read all over the world, translated into many different languages, and was an important contribution to those who were seeking an alternative to the Hebraic religions, and was very inspiring. Marco Pallis himself got to know about Tibetan Buddhism, in particular Milarepa, through his travels in Bhutan, Sikkim, and later on the borders and borderlands of Tibet. Alexander Maitland, we're really pleased is with us today, and it's a talk about the writing of the opera Milarepa and what's happened to the manuscripts and where the manuscript stands now, and so on. And I think a very fitting subject for today, our 95th anniversary, and the fact that it falls on the end of Interfaith Week. Because people like Milarepa stand head and shoulders above the rest of us. Their lives point to something beyond the narrow sectarianism of any particular religion, and Milarepa in particular is a religious figure of world significance. So thank you all very much, and thank you, Alexander.
And I can say without fear or contradiction that Marco Pallis would have been completely in touch with everything, with all the sentiments that you've expressed about the merging of East and West, of Buddhism and Western thought and culture. I'm going to play a little of Marco's music, which may come out fairly loudly, so it's just so that you won't be startled, but just to give you a taste of it. That isn't, in fact, from Milarepa. It's a composition which is exactly contemporary with it, called Nocturne de l'Éphémère. It's based on a poem written by Marco's brother Andreas called the Mayfly's Elegy, but it's very much in sympathy with the score of the opera, which is large and complicated, but I promise you it's very close to it. I'm going to read this, if you don't mind, just to get it all together. In his French version of Milarepa's biography, Jacques Bacot very plausibly takes Mila to be an ancient and more or less local interjection denoting fright or fear, and by extension, one who has power to frighten or so exorcise evil spirits. The suffix repa refers to the thin cotton cloth worn by Kagyotpa yogis, which is emblematic of spiritual intellect. It seems natural, indeed almost inevitable, that Marco Pallis should have written an opera based on episodes of the life of Jetsun Milarepa, the 11th century Tibetan poet, singer, and saint. Both were devout Buddhists, and lived and traveled among the mountains of northern India and Tibet. Milarepa, the great yogi, born with a beautiful voice, improvised and sang 100,000 Buddhist songs. Pallis was a writer, philosopher, and composer, an enthusiast of early music, especially of 16th and 17th century chamber music, who established the English Consort of Viols and was for some years professor of viols at the Royal College of Music in London. Marco Alexander Pallis was the youngest of Alexander and Julia Pallis's 5 children. He was born on the 19th of June, 1895, into a Greek family whose considerable wealth derived from banking and trade. Marco and his brothers and sisters were brought up in the Greek tradition. His sister Marietta, who became an artist and an outstanding botanist, was perhaps the closest to Marco both intellectually and spiritually. As a boarder at Harrow School from 1908 to 1910, Marco persuaded the school chaplain to give him extra lessons in religion, and after returning to the family home in Liverpool, where his education continued with private tutors, he dallied briefly with Catholicism. This phase ended abruptly when his mother informed the priest, "If my son becomes a Roman Catholic, there will be no money." Pallis attended extramural classes in entomology at the University of Liverpool, and in 1911 he spent several weeks studying insects in the forests of Guyana. At Cambrai during the First World War, Pallis was wounded in the knee and told that he would never walk properly again. Despite his doctor's advice, he was soon well enough to travel in the Arctic with Augustin Courtauld and climb with the Liverpool Wayfarers Club in the Peak District, Scotland, Snowdonia, the Dolomites, and Switzerland. After he had been discharged from the army in 1918, his father gave him a large sum of money, which ensured his independence and enabled him to pursue his increasing fascination with mountaineering and music. In 1920, aged 25, he began to study the harpsichord and the viola da gamba with Arnold Dolmetsch, the famous instrument maker, virtuoso, and visionary at Dolmetsch's house in Hazelmere. From then on, mountaineering and early music became Marco's consuming passions, and the harpsichord and the viol his instruments of choice. Among Dolmetsch's disciples, with whom Pallis developed close friendships, were Robert Donington and Elizabeth Goebel, both famous musicians, and Richard Nicholson, who became Marco's inseparable companion for more than 60 years. Working at an upright piano in the basement of his home in Akeworth Drive in Liverpool, Pallis composed an opera titled Ihalaba, for which he also wrote the libretto and designed the costumes. But this work, like Milarepa, was never staged, and the whereabouts of the score and other materials associated with it are unknown. Without evidence of a story or a subject, we can only guess at what the opera was about. Ihalaba, like Milarepa, may have been the name of a person, or was it perhaps inspired by the Halaba people, an isolated mixed community of Christians and Muslims living in the central highlands of Ethiopia? But this seems unlikely, since by then, by the late 20s, Marco had become increasingly drawn to the arts, history, and religions of the East, and to Mahayana Buddhism in particular. It's quite probable that Marco's elder sister and confidant, Marietta, had known the history of Ihalaba, but it's doubtful that she knew anything about his plans for Milarepa, which may not have begun to take shape until sometime after Marietta's death in 1963. Marietta had been exceptionally gifted. This is a self-portrait that she painted. A botanist, ecologist, artist, writer, and philosophical biologist. In 1935, she purchased 76 acres of marshland in Norfolk Broads, where she lived and worked in what has been described as a devotional landscape and a counter-modern setting. She and Marco were both deeply interested in their Greek ancestry, praised the virtues of active and contemplative life, and lamented the decline in traditional forms of dress as a concomitant of progress. Some of Marietta's drawings and paintings were very fine, not least a closely observed charcoal study of Marco as a young man playing the viol. And let's just look at some of them. Marco's in the middle, his brother Andreas, who wrote the poem for which Marco wrote the opening music, and Alec, his other brother, sitting on the right-hand side. And here's a charcoal sketch which was developed into a more finished drawing, but I love that rather unfinished feeling of Marco playing the viol. Now, it's interesting, the viola da gamba simply means the leg viol. And the reason it's called the leg viol is because you hold it between your knees, exactly as he's doing there. It was only in the 1890s that viols and cellos were allowed to have a little stick at the bottom which attached them to the floor, as it were, and made life easier for the players. But this is an interesting drawing. It interests me very much in particular because Marietta was careful and observant, and yet she's drawn, if you look at where the shoulders of the viol come into the neck, they're hitting the neck almost at right angles, like a cello or a violin. And really, I'm sure this is perfectly accurate. It's probably a German instrument. But the fact is that viols normally slope up slightly to the neck, and they have frets made of string, which you can move up and down. There's 7 strings, cellos have 4 strings. They're tuned differently. They're really quite different and rather gentler instruments, and they don't have the power to give the black and white contrast that cellos can do, very strong contrast. The viol's a gentler thing. So you can see by the way Marco's holding it. And the all-important thing to mention, and he would want me to mention this as well, is that unlike a cello or violin, you don't play it overhand, but you hold the bow like that, and you play it with your hand, the palm of your hand upwards, and your fingers touching the strings slightly. It gives you a lot of control and gentleness. So that's about it. I shared practically everything I know about the viol with you, and I hope it's been helpful. With 4 friends, all skilled mountaineers, Marco Pallis traveled in 1933 to Gangotri at the source of the Ganges and climbed Rio Pargo, whose summit peak, according to legend, consisted of a single immense sapphire. Above Rio Pargo are summer pastures where cows and sheep grazed among the pale mauve delphiniums and blue gentians. A chaos of ice and shattered rock turned Pallis's thoughts towards death and impermanence. The stones which remain, they too are gradually dying. Death is not an appanage only of the living, nor are the living alone in being subject to death. In this is to be seen the pattern of all things. Thus spoke the Tibetan Lama, a shade whose invisible presence haunted Pallis throughout his mountain wanderings. As he stood on the summit of Rio Pargo, Pallis felt the whole mountain lay beneath his feet, and yet at that instant came the ghostly Lama's reproof. Whose feet did I hear you mention? How can you talk of your feet when there is no real person in the name of you? There exists indeed a certain bundle of mental and physical properties, temporally associated, ever-changing. Soon they will be dissolved again. Which of them then will keep the right to say that he was Marco? The spirit voice continued, you have not conquered Rio Pargil either, though there exists an aggregate of stones and ice, called purely for convenience by that name. If there be no vanquished, there can be no victor. There can be no true achievement, as long as there persists the slightest hankering after individual enjoyment of its fruits. If you don't realize that, why do you climb? On this, the first of their Himalayan journeys, Pallis and Nicholson brought their viols with them and every evening played them in camp. They brought viols with them again in 1936, when Pallis led another small party to the Zemu Glacier in northern Sikkim, intent on climbing the 22,000-foot snow peaks Simbu and Sanyotko. Their gallant attempt to climb Simbu had to be abandoned, however, when they found the way to the summit barred by a crevasse as broad and as deep as a castle moat. Pallis observed philosophically in his book, Peaks and Lamas, perhaps our defeat on Simbu was symbolical. We climbed no more peaks of ice and snow on our travels, for we were led into a different world. We became pilgrims of the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. On the way to Simbu, when Pallis visited the hermit abbot of Lachen in his retreat at Tangu, high up in the Tista Valley, the beautiful Tista Valley, north of Kalimpong, the abbot had asked the true purpose of his expedition to the snow mountains. To Pallis's answer that he traveled for love of wild solitude and to avoid the noise and bustle of towns, the abbot replied, you will never find it thus. It cannot be won by such methods. The solitude you seek is in the concentration of your own heart. If you have once found it, it will not matter where you are. By then, Pallis was acquainted with the life and teachings of Milarepa, and he reminded the abbot how Milarepa sang the praises of mountains and wilderness, recommending them to those who wished to master the art of solitude. If Milarepa, who aspired to Buddhahood in a single lifetime, had found the undistracted atmosphere of the mountains helpful, Pallis ended, can we be blamed for wishing to escape from the turmoil sometimes? While he had never meant to compare the mountaineer's love of solitude with the spiritual purpose of Milarepa's retreats or those of the abbot, knowing that such a comparison was either irreverent or pure romance, already he had become increasingly fascinated with Milarepa, the sorcerer turned saint, and Milarepa's uncompromising search for enlightenment and Buddhahood. Having returned from Simbu, Pallis, Nicholson, and another member of their party planned to stay in the monastery at Lobrak, near the Bhutan border, and there receive Buddhist instruction at the birthplace of Saint Marpa, who became Milarepa's spiritual guide. But when this proved to be impractical, Pallis and Nicholson instead were given instruction by one of Marpa's spiritual descendants, the Venerable Konshog Gyaltsen at Pyang in Ladakh. That's Marco at about that time, give or take a few years, looking very serene and contemplative, very typical attitude. And there is the monastery at Pyang, the great monastery. Now, Gyaltsen, whose name translates as banner of the most precious things, came from a peasant family in the Pyang Valley, and the order of lamas to which Pyang adhered was a branch of the Red Kargyutpa, the oral tradition order, which traces its descent directly from Marpa of Lobrak and the great Jetsun Milarepa himself. Another view of the monastery of Yags. In 1947, Marco Pallis and Richard Nicholson finally achieved their ambition of traveling in Tibet when they were initiated into the Yellow Cap Order at Tashilhunpo Monastery, the traditional home of the Panchen Lama at Shigatse. Thereafter, Pallis would be known among Buddhists as Tubden La, or Tubden Tenzin, or sometimes as tradition. And Nicholson as Tubden Shedup. Marco used to call Richard Tubden. I could never understand when I first met him what it really was about, but it was Tubden, get this Tubden. It was charming. Konshog Gyaltsen was also an artist and a calligrapher who painted traditional tankas and made copies of religious books from the monastery library. As Pallis watched him attended by his 12-year-old novice, he imagined himself to be in the workshop of a Master Jerome or Fra Angelico. In conversation with Gyaltsen, Pallis reprised subjects that he discussed previously with the abbot of Lachen, including the physical sufferings endured by Milarepa while he meditated starving in remote mountain caves, and teachings of the French Buddhist and mystic Alexandre David Neil, who, according to Marco Pallis, was the only European who had practiced successfully the difficult art of tumo, the trance state capable of inducing bodily heat. And let me show you some photographs of Marco's journey with Richard in 1947-49. These are some, it's a Turkey caravan at Gartok, and some yaks. These are standing about in an open space. And a Ladakhi standing, a local man standing at the front of his house with this beautiful wooden door behind the masonry, and standing very sensibly parked on a large stone, keep the snow away from his door. There's Marco on the left and Richard on the right in their hats on the Changla, which is the North Pass at 17,000 feet. It's probably the highest pass in North India. And it leads from the Indus Valley to Lake Pangong, about 90 miles long, very long winding lake called the High Grassland Lake. And this pass, broadly speaking, it divides from the Indus Valley to Tibet. The lake associated with it, Lake Pangong, is a great stretch of water. It's called a grassland lake, but in fact the land round about it is simply brownish grey rubble and dirt, really, earth. It doesn't have much grass about it, so it must be an historical name for the lake. I'm sorry, I'm having some trouble with this thing. It's very distracting, but we'll do what we can. And that's a bridge over the Indus. All these photographs Marco insisted upon giving me. These are from his original prints that he gave me in February 1966. Now, I felt embarrassed about taking them, kept on giving them to me. And I knew they were old, and Richard said, "Oh no, Marco wants you to have them. He wants you to have them, take them, take them." And he was most insistent, and I'm so glad that he did. And this is the Zojila, which is the Blizzard Pass, the Great Blizzard Pass, closed by heavy snowfalls every year. Horses and men can't get through, let alone modern transport. And here is a view of the monastery at Spituk, a dramatic, wonderful picture. And the monastery you can just see there on the right. And it was founded in the 11th century. So it's very exactly contemporary with Milarepa. I made a note here, which I'd just like to see if we can add anything to that short description. Oh yes, it's rather important. It started its incarnation, if I may say that, as a red hat, as a part of the Red Hat order, and in the 15th century became associated with the Yellow Hat Buddhist order. At his home in Liverpool the following year, Pallis was visited by the Reverend Dr. Geshe Wangyal, a Mongolian religious from Lhasa, under whose guidance he further perfected the instruction he had received from Konshog Gyaltsen at Pyang. Together with Lama Wangyal, he read the Lamrim, or Stages in the Path, the main doctrinal book of the Yellow Cap order, the most influential order, as you all know, in modern Tibet. Turning the pages of the Lamrim, Pallis would have kept in mind Milarepa's reflections on the path to wisdom, to right knowledge, and the beautiful song he sang in reply to the rich and devious Geshe Safwa's request to interpret for him a book of philosophy at a marriage feast held in the autumn of the Wood Tiger year, 1074. And this is what Milarepa sang. Accustomed long to meditating on the whispered chosen truths, I have forgot all that is said in written and in printed books. Accustomed long to application of each new experience to mine own growth spiritual, I have forgot all creeds and dogmas. Accustomed long to know the meaning of the wordless, I have forgot the way to trace the roots of verbs, the source of words and phrases. The fact that as a reader, researcher, writer, and translator, books were essentials of Marco Pallis's secular and devotional life, in no way compromised or diminished his profound respect for Milarepa's exposition of the yogic way to supramundaneness, which transcended intellectual approaches to salvation and all forms of religious affiliation. For Milarepa, knowledge was not to be won by the study of books, nor by making professions of faith. As Walter Yealing Evans-Wentz observed in the preface to his second annotated edition of Lama Kazi Davasamdam's English rendering of the Jetsun Kavum, Milarepa's biography given to the saint's disciple Rechung, many of the most cultivated and learned pundits and yogis, saints, in India and Tibet had been illiterate. On a visit to Kalimpong in 1924, Evans-Wentz was able to acquire from the late Lama's son the manuscript of the Jetsun Kavum, and in Oxford the following year he began its adaptation. That same year, 1925, appeared Jacques Bacot's abridged French translation of the biography, titled in French, Milarepa, le poète tibétain, ses crimes, ses épreuves, son nirvana. Pallis acclaimed Jacques Bacot's translation as a work of genius, and upon this he based the libretto of his opera, of which this is small sampling. It's taken, that's from an original manuscript, of which there are so many. And what we're doing just now, what I'm doing just now, trying to do, I mustn't be presumptuous, but in trying the last 3 years, is to make sense of this deluge of notation and the manuscript of the libretto. Wonderfully exciting work. Accepting there existed one more or less standardized Tibetan text, Jacques Bacot noted that in the last 2 chapters of Lama Sandup's English rendering, the folio numbers given of the corresponding Tibetan text did not agree with those from which he had made his French translation, and this suggested that the Lama's rendering, edited by Dr. Evans-Wentz, and Jacques Bacot's translation were based on different Tibetan editions which may have varied depending on which monastery they'd been printed. By trading wool and other commodities in winter and tending to their cattle herds in summer, Milarepa's grandfather, Mila Dotun Senge, and his father, Mila Dorje Senge, had accumulated great wealth. His mother, Kalmo Kayen, meaning white garden, came from a distinguished family in Yang, near the Tibetan border. Milarepa and his younger sister, Peta Gongkyet, which means fortunate protectress, were brought up at Kiangsa, on the frontier of Nepal and Tibet, in their parents' substantial 3-storied house known as the 4 columns and 8 pillars. It was here that Milarepa was born on the 25th of August, 1052, the male water dragon year. On receiving the news, his father, who was away trading at the time, named him Topaga, which means delightful to hear, the name by which he's also known in Marco Pallis's opera. In Rechung's biography, the future Milarepa recalled how as children, he and Petta had their hair plaited with gold and turquoise. All this changed for the worse when their father died, and everything their father had possessed was taken from them and their widowed mother by a paternal uncle and aunt. Having lived in great comfort, Kalmulkayan and her children were forced to work in summer in her brother-in-law's fields, and in winter spin and card wool for his wife. They were given food fit only for dogs, and dressed in rags tied together with string. They grew thin and haggard, and their hair became infested with lice. Villagers who had known the family in happier times pitied them and wept. The opening scenes of Pallis's opera were inspired by this melancholy chapter of Milarepa's story. When her desperate attempt to restore her son's patrimony failed, Milarepa's, that is to say, Topaga's mother, urged him to seek instruction from a powerful guru versed in black magic and avenge the wrongs done to them by their cruel relatives. Should he fail, she swore that she would kill herself before his eyes. And that is part of the libretto. You can see at the bottom, you can see the name Bon coming up. She's talking about somebody who has learned the old evils of the Bon magicians and still can practice this, who can produce death from a distance. You'll see more of that just in a second. There you have it here. Dans l'art de tuer de loin, the art of killing from afar. And if I may, my French pronunciation is pretty execrable. I've only beaten for this as a schoolboy, but let me just try again as an act of perversity to read you a little French, because the entire libretto is in French. Stage directions, everything is in French, as we said, based on Jacques Bacot's book. C'est au nord du pays que tu les trouveras là où vivent les adhérents de l'ancien culte de Bonn. C'est parmi leurs chemins que l'on rencontre les sorciers les plus habiles. Si tu reviens chez moi sans avoir accompli ta mission, sois sûr que moi, ta vieille mère, me tuerai sous les yeux. And that's exactly how it sounds. The entire thing is very, very strong. Not the same thing in English at all. Basically, she's simply saying, if you don't come back, I'll kill myself. Very powerful. Milarepa obeyed his mother's wish and, aided by the magician Lama Yalung Kyorpo and the magician's friend Kulung Yonton Gyatso, a respected tantric physician and exponent of the black arts, he destroyed the house of his uncle and aunt where their eldest son's marriage ceremony was taking place, killing 35 people, including the bride and groom. Due to an extraordinary twist of fate, Milarepa's uncle and aunt, the intended victims of his spell, emerged from the ruins, grief-stricken, unharmed, each crying, "Everyone is dead. If only I could also be dead. Tout mort, que ne je suis mort aussi." So they both sing that. And you see it coming up. I'm going rather quickly through these because they're difficult to read even at close range, let alone away at the back of a big room like this. But it gives you an idea of it. And there's Peta telling her mother at the top, they're all dead, they're all dead. Terrible moment. Having enlisted further help from Lama Yarlung Kyorpo, Milarepa next conjured a violent hailstorm which destroyed an entire year's barley crop in the neighborhood where Milarepa, his mother and sister lived. So enraged were the farmers that Milarepa had to flee for his life. While his mother rejoiced, she was so happy this had happened, Milarepa, conscience-stricken, determined to atone for his actions and devote the rest of his life to searching for enlightenment. He left his mother and sister to fend for themselves, determined to find an accomplished teacher who would provide him with insights and the instruction he needed. When he confided this change to heart to Lama Yarlung Kyorpo, the black magician advised him to approach Marpa, the translator, the great Indian Saint Naropa's disciple and worthiest among the worthiest of men. Hearing Marpa's name, Milarepa felt a sudden surge of excitement, and his mind was filled with an inexpressible feeling of delight. Almost immediately, he set out for Lobrak, and Doalong monastery where Marpa lived with his wife, Dagmema, the Reverend Mother. In old age, Milarepa told Reshung, his biographer, all along the way I was possessed by but one idea. When shall I set my eyes upon my Guru? When shall I behold his face? Failing to recognize Marpa, he asked an old man by the roadside, Venerable old man, pray tell me, is this the neighborhood inhabited by the Lama Marpa? Venerable vieillard, je te prie de m'informer si dans ce voisinage habite le Lama Marpa. Tell me where you can be found. And the old man replied, but you found him already. See, tu l'as déjà trouvé, Marpa, c'est moi. Whereupon, at Marpa's invitation, Milarepa prostrated himself before him. Milarepa's repentance and his search for a guru constituted the first in a series of 9 meritorious acts by which he attained the perfect state of Buddhahood. The second of these 9 acts obliged him to fulfill with unwavering obedience his guru's every command. In the third, he obtained the truths which procured spiritual development and final emancipation. The period of meditation supervised by his guru constituted the fourth. In the fifth act, he obtained the final ear-whispered occult truths and afterwards bade farewell to his guru. The sixth was the act of impulsion, whereby he vowed to devote his life to attaining the highest goal. In the seventh act, he carried out his guru's commands energetically, untiringly, in a secluded place, far from the haunts of men and worldly temptations. By the eighth, he gained transcendental knowledge and experience which enabled him to confer benefit upon all sentient beings. And by the ninth and final act of dissolving his mortal body into cosmic space, he imparted by example his ultimate teaching so that every sentient being might feel impelled to live the religious life. Until Marpa accepted him for spiritual training, in order to prove his competence and expunge his evil deeds, Milarepa suffered many trials and tribulations through doing penance for the death and destruction he had caused by practicing black magic. Marpa commanded him to construct a number of buildings of different sizes, and as soon as one was finished, to demolish it and carry the clay and stones back to the place where he had found them. He also administered harsh beatings, very strange things for a guru to do. And this puzzled Milarepa. He couldn't understand why somebody as pure and good and selfless as Marpa was behaving in this way. Marpa's ever-changing moods and purposeless labor of building and rebuilding, which came close to breaking Milarepa's spirit and left his back raw from from bleeding sores were designed to test his resolve and his readiness for initiation. Having examined the wounds, Marco assured Milarepa that his physical sufferings were nothing compared to those endured by Saint Naropa, who had been forced to undergo 12 greater and 12 lesser trials, making 24 in all. Once, when two passers-by tried to help Milarepa by putting a heavy cornerstone back in place for him, Marco struck Milarepa with his stick, exclaiming, "But my orders are aimed at you. On no account must you receive help from strangers." And then he said, "I, Milarepa, did not spare my wealth or consider my body's safety, but sacrificing both ungrudgingly, I followed and served my teacher Naropa." In the seventh and final scene of the second part of the opera, the Reverend Mother summons Milarepa for a long-awaited audience with his guru, telling him that, "My dear child, the Marpa is now appeased, he's calmed. The end of your testing time, your épreuve, your tests, is approaching, and the Lama will now see you and explain all this to you." In certain ways, Marco Pallis's relationship with Arnold and Mabel Dolmetsch resembled Milarepa's life with Marpa and Dagmema. Pallis wrote that in the Dolmetsch household, Arnold Dolmetsch's viewpoint generally prevailed, and there was no room for divided opinion in his proximity. As for Mabel, except in the sphere of early dance, that is to say of the 15th and 16th centuries in Europe, where her authority was undisputed by common consent, the one sure criterion was the master's judgment, which she espoused through thick and thin, and so it was at L'Aubrac, where Dagmema, the Reverend Mother, deferred to her husband in almost everything. Let's show a little bit of film, and it'll show Mabel dancing and her husband playing the harpsichord or the lute, depending on which version we've got. Absolutely charming, I think. Don't you agree? Lovely. And she's wearing what I was always brought up to hear my aunts describe as a frock. You don't see many frocks nowadays, I'm afraid, with all respect to the ladies present. I hope this, by the way, isn't going on too long. Can I go on a bit longer with it? Mm-hmm. There's a little more to do. Whereas Milarepa had suffered and had been dependent on Marpa and Dagmema for food and shelter, Pallis's substantial inheritance, he was very rich, enabled him to provide Arnold Dolmetsch with money to build a larger studio workshop at Hazelmere on the site of a ruined stable where the Dolmetsches had previously kept goats. At Hazelmere, Pallis and his contemporaries studied and practiced conscientiously in surroundings of comparative ease. Unlike Milarepa, who lived and meditated in remote caves, barely clothed or naked, his emaciated body and the hair on his head colored green, like that, from eating nothing but grass, herbs, and leaves. His sister Peta was shocked by his wasted appearance, but deeply moved by her brother's joyful determination to attain nirvana within a single lifetime. Dolmetsch's teaching, based on wisdom and method, and the moving story of Milarepa's spiritual journey from sinner to sainthood, recounted in Bacco's splendid translation, gave Marco Pallis the inspiration and materials he needed to start work on his opera. Exactly when this work began, we can't be certain. He was awarded an honorary fellowship of the Royal Academy of Music, and in 1975 he retired after 10 years as Professor of Viols at the Royal College in Kensington. In October 1978, he and Richard Nicholson left their charming house in Egerton Terrace in Knightsbridge and afterwards lived for varying lengths of time in Cambridge and Switzerland before moving to a small flat in Chesham Place, a few minutes' walk from Sloane Square. These are further images of Milarepa, this one by Nicholas Roerich. And another similar. Marco in Switzerland with his niece Adrian, and Adrian's children Vivian, who's a friend of ours, and her brother Charles. Marco looking very happy, clutching his knees in a typical sort of attitude. And this is a Christmas sort of tea party. Richard Nicholson on the right, and a rather contemplative, rather drifting away into his own thoughts, as he often did. Marco trying to get him back into some sort of state of attention, and Charles looking on and probably about to ask for some more of that delicious Christmas cake sitting in front. And here we have the great monastery of Lichi. The Lichi monastery is the frontispiece of Marco's book, his first and probably most famous book, Peaks and Lamas. But let's go back to the opera. The quantity of manuscript drafts and alterations from which in due course Nicholson produced a 97-page fair copy of parts 1 and 2 seem to indicate that Pallis had worked on the opera for some considerable time. And besides, whether he was composing music or writing, he would never permit himself to be hurried. As an example, the 3 books for which he's best known were published at intervals of 20 years, Peaks and Lamas. This one, that's the American edition, Tista Valley, nice photograph there. And some of his other books, the Buddhist Spectrum, and the first edition here, the bottom second from the left on the bottom of The Way in the Mountain, published by Peter Owen in London. It's true that apart from these, he had also translated Buddhist writings into Greek, translated into English several books by the metaphysician René Guénon, and contributed articles on music and Buddhism to various papers such as The Consort, The Eastern Buddhist, and Tomorrow. He also composed the Nocturne de l'Éphémère, which we had at the very, very beginning, a little snatch of that, inspired by his brother Andreas's poem, and that was recorded in September 1980 and performed at the Queen Elizabeth Hall. Now, the actual opera, Milarepa, was begun, the writing of the opera was begun very precisely on the 9th of December 1981. And there is the proof. The archive stamp at the top, Milarepa, Part 1, tableau, and in Dominic Vlasto, Marco's great nephew's handwriting, the date and the year. He had completed parts 1, 2, and 3 by the 16th of November the following year, but we may fairly assume that before then he had the story of the opera very clearly in mind, followed by the all-important sound picture from which he developed Milarepa's orchestral and vocal scores. Pallis divided the first and second parts of Milarepa's vocal score into 3 tableaus and 7 tableaus respectively. The score and stage directions were all adapted from Bacco's translation, and this is indicated by the opera's title and subtitle, drame spirituel en quatre parties, utilisant le texte traduit par Jacques Bacot avec les adaptations inévitables. In other words, of course he had to change it. Inevitably, he had to change it a bit. Although all the 4 parts of the opera exist in manuscript, Milarepa, like its predecessor, Ihalaba, has never been performed, and while Marco's manuscript and Nicholson's fair copy of parts 1 and 2 correspond and present as finished work, and parts 3 and 4 in Pallis's handwriting appear to be complete, it's impossible to say for certain how much had been set aside for further consideration and possibly inclusion, but was never traced. It might have been discarded. At the beginning of part 3, scene 1, a memorandum for the players of rebecks and violins ends with Pallis's instruction that vibrato, which he believed was all too often overdone, when they make the note shake about like that on the string, it must at all costs be avoided. That was his only definite instruction to the musicians. While the handwritten drafts of parts 1 and part 2 are clear and legible, in general the same can't be said of part 3 and part 4. In capital letters and a bold, firm hand, Pallis has titled part 4, Death and Apotheosis of Milarepa. Towards the end, however, his writing in pencil and biro is heavily corrected, indistinct, and occasionally difficult to read. This applies equally to the libretto and the music, and to the last few pages of the opera in particular. What, if any, may be the significance of such a lapse is hard to tell. Pallis was by then well into his 80s, and by no means in perfect health, and we can only suppose that he had felt wearied by his efforts, not least by the urgent task of writing the opera's closing sequences while the words and music were still fresh and vivid in his mind. Surrounded by his disciples, Milarepa died aged 84 in the quiescent state of samadhi at the cave of Brilsche, his retreat in Shubar, at dawn on the last day of winter, AD 1135, the Buddha year. His last words, which I'll try to translate, were, "I now prostrate myself at Marpa's feet, at the feet of my predestined Lama. I've done my best to cope with my 5 impardonable sins and efface those by repentance. I have no idea how long I have left to live, but now I want you to listen to me about this. I want you to try to do as I have tried to do." His voice at this point becomes feeble, and he dies quietly. Sa voix s'affaiblit, sa voix s'affaiblit, il meurt paisiblement. And all this happened, or happens, on a hilltop, crowded by a stupa, whose door or opening, gateway, is open, and the disciples are arranged around the stupa. And in the closing scene of the opera, his disciples chant, "Salut, salut, salut, homage aux trois joyaux," homage to the 3 joys. And then they keep on repeating that. And then they say, "Glory to the Master, the insurpassable Master, whom today has triumphed." Let all beings, without exception, know before too long the meaning of deliverance. Salut, homage, homage aux trois joyaux. Let it be so, ainsi soit dit, let it be so. And then the stupa opens again, and you see Milarepa completely surrounded by glory. And this next thing is quite beautiful. At that instant, the sky shone with prismatic colors, geometric patterns, and lotus flowers decorated with beautiful mandalas. Glorious music and singing filled the air, and a host of devas and dakinis, as well as other celestial beings and divine manifestations, pervaded the heavens. Such was the great yogi Milarepa's final apotheosis. On the 5th of June 1989, a fortnight before his 95th birthday, Marco Pallis died peacefully in Surrey with his devoted companion Richard Nicholson and two of their close friends at his bedside. Pallis's life had been an exemplary marriage of wisdom and method, activity and contemplation. In this way did he enter the heavenly fields forever and ever, and join in the blissful feast of the auspicious gift of eternally increased blessings. And I'm just going to play a little bit more of his music, which Odin has very expertly recorded. Oh, what have I done now? Poor Odin. Dear, I am sorry about that. Okay, let me try just once more. I'm not very good with machinery. There we are. Now, it's been a rather long one, but I hope not too long, and I hope you enjoyed it. May I just say very, very quickly, but all importantly, that I rather rushed through certain parts of it and left out bits which made it a bit jerky, I'm afraid, so I do apologize for that. I was trying not to overrun the time. But I really do want to thank Odin, who's worked tirelessly on all sorts of aspects of this talk and recordings and spent so much time and given me so much help. And also Philip Swift, who's away at the moment, and Marlon for their help. But also, all importantly, I mustn't fail to thank Marco's great niece Vivian and her husband Dennis Bradley. Dennis recorded the Nocturne de l'Éphémère for me. And Marco's great nephew and family archivist, our friend Dominic Rasto, for much valuable advice and encouragement and support, and above all, too, for their generous permission to include the illustrations and, all important, musical examples. So many, many warm thanks to one and all. That's it.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
Where can we get hold of the opera recordings? Is there any CD or
Of the Nocturne?
of the opera?
The opera, it's never been recorded.
Never.
No. You see, the last 3 years have been devoted to trying to piece together. As I said, it's like detection in the sense it's like police work, and it's pulling together all the notation, the librettos, and there are countless versions of these written over a period of perhaps 20 years. Formally, it started in December 1981, but he'd been working long before that. There's no question about that. I mean, I'm sure he was working on it when I first met him, 50 years ago. And he always had the impression, he always gave one the impression of being somewhere else, in a very nice way. It wasn't that he was showing disinterest in you or showing no interest in you, but he was always floating about in his thoughts. And he would jump around from different subjects to subject, you know. Sometimes it would be music, sometimes travel, sometimes natural history. Buddhism, of course, again and again and again, his thoughts and what he was writing for the Eastern Buddhist or whoever it might be that would come up in a conversation. But he was a fascinating and a sort of polymathic person, an extraordinary person. But sadly, there's no recording.
Do you think that there's any possibility that at some point this recording?
Yes, I do.
Become
I do think so, but the trouble is that we've got to be able to assemble an orchestra which includes not only European instruments, but Indian and Tibetan instruments and people who can play them. And we need singers, and good ones, because a lot of the libretto and the score, the vocal score, when you read it, is extremely complicated, and there's a huge amount of overlapping. For example, in these scenes, which I didn't go on about too much before the uncle and aunt's house is demolished from afar by Milarepa and his sorcerers, the Eredicum feel trembling. It's like an earthquake, and they're singing at each other. So this is going on. It raises the tension. It's very cleverly done. And he's very skilled in that way. He knew what he was doing.
Yeah, it would be wonderful because Milarepa's life is as dramatic as any other operas that we've seen out there. It's
Yes.
pure drama.
It's terrific stuff. It's fantastic stuff.
It would be amazing to hear the whole.
You might need to speak with Nitin Suwani. I think Nitin Suwani is probably somebody who could help.
Oh yes, that's perfectly, yes, perfectly
in
true.
relation to opera and Indian classical music.
Yes, absolutely correct. He is perfectly correct. And needless to say, of course, the Royal College of Music is very interested too. And it's their own story. I mean, it's a question of actually putting it together and paying for it. It's as simple as that, and it's quite a big thing to do. And I felt it was slightly out of my reach from that point of view.
Yeah.
The other thing, very quickly, was that I did go on a bit about Marco, I know, to begin with, and then get into Milarepa rather slowly, but it seemed to me important, and rightly or wrongly, I don't know, you'll have to judge, but I thought it was important just today, rather than deluging you with this sort of history of going through page after page of staff sheets and notation and so forth, which is, it's interesting, but it's a little bit sort of remote, perhaps, from the Buddhist Society and from here. And I felt it was more interesting to talk about Marco and Milarepa as Buddhists whose travels and interests and work and philosophies had come together over a period of 1,000 years and resulted in this extraordinary work. So that was the idea.